Almost everything you do in Diablo 3 relies on your weapon damage. Your melee attack scale of your weapon damage, your magical spell scale of your weapon damage, and even your summon scale of your weapon damage. So if weapons are such an important part of the game, what would happen if you didn't use one? Is it even possible to beat the game this way, and why would anyone even? Hi, in this video I'm going to try and beat Diablo 3 without a weapon. I'm not allowed to have any weapon equipped even if I don't use it to attack. Offhand equipment that add to your base damage are kind of weapons to me, so they are not allowed either. Shields are fine though. I chose the Crusader class for this challenge for 3 reasons. I thought a melee character would better suit the theme of this challenge, even though casters are just as heavily reliant on their weapon. I've never beaten the game with a Crusader before. And finally, I thought the Crusader had a few tricks up his sleeve for this challenge. It turns out I was wrong about this, but more on that soon. I began the game on normal difficulty just outside of New Tristram. I battled some zombies on the road, and while I was clearly hitting these zombies with my big metal shield, my starting skill Punish scales off my weapon damage, just like the rest of them. As I was helping the town's guard fight off a horde of zombies, let's take a look at how damage works in this game. You have a flat damage value, which mainly comes from your weapon. Then there are a lot of ways to increase this damage, like increasing your character's primary attribute, your attack speed, critical hit chance, etc. But the pure damage from your weapon is always the base, so it's by far the most important factor for your damage output. However, even without a weapon I did deal some damage. I guess my fist was good for a couple of points. And that was what I had to work with for this challenge. I leveled up to level 2 and unlocked Shield Bash, the third reason why I picked the Crusader. It mainly scales off your weapon damage like all other skills, but it also scales off your shield's block chance. Based off the wording of this skill, I thought I had found a loophole in the challenge. I was hoping that last part about my shield block might add flat plus to damage, but after some testing it only further increases the damage multiplier of the skill. Which makes perfect sense, since that's how the other skills work. This was a bit of a setback for my plans right away, but for now my damage was fine anyway. I went out on a quest to clear the surroundings of zombies. I smashed some of them with my shield and mixed it up by bashing some with the shield instead. Then I went into the cathedral looking for Deckard Cain, who had gone there to investigate a star falling from the sky. After equipping a few pieces of gear, I started to look like a certain Marvel hero. I found Deckard Cain and rescued him from a giant skeleton with relative ease. I got a new shield as a reward, and I also unlocked the first skill rune. Runes are basically skill modifiers that you unlock as you level up, ranging from damage increases to adding status effects to sometimes even completely changing what the skill does. Back in town, I convinced the blacksmith to join me on my quest by helping him kill his wife.
I couldn't have done this without you. I'm in your debt.
I went to a cemetery to look for the Skeleton King Leoric's crown. It was still early in the game, but I already started to notice my lack of damage. I fought 2 mini-bosses guarding the crown. First Mangalmaw, and then the Chancellor.
No, I will not allow you to bring that monster Leoric back to this world.
After defeating the Chancellor, I found the crown and went back to town. Well, I found the legendary helm Leoric's crown, which is kind of funny because this was not the quest item I was looking for, which is also called Leoric's crown. The quest item is over here. I wasn't sure if this was a flavor win or a flavor fail, or maybe the Chancellor was a dirty item duper. I didn't end up using the legendary helm though, since it would lower my damage without any strength on it, and I needed every bit of damage I could get. After completing this quest, I unlocked the ability to craft gear. I didn't bother with doing anything right away, but the blacksmith can make all kinds of gear for you. This was going to be important later to keep my gear upgraded as I progressed through the game. At level 10, I unlocked my first passive skill slot as well as the first 2 passive skills. One of them only works if you wield a one-handed weapon, and the other one lets you wield a two-handed weapon along with a shield but reduces your damage. What a cruel joke for this challenge. I saved a Templar from some cultists and helped him get revenge on one of his allies who had betrayed him for the dark side.
Betrayal can never be forgiven.
He offered to join me, and I decided to let him because I was going to need all the help I could get. He was going to have to play by the same rules as me though, so no weapon for him either. Just a couple of armored knights punching bad guys. I tracked down the Skeleton King, and oh my, this was a grind of a boss fight. My defenses were good, so I wasn't really in any danger of dying, but he took so little damage from my attacks. I kept beating him with my shield over and over, and after about 5 minutes he finally went down. First boss completed, but at the same time I was starting to realize just how much of a grind this challenge was gonna be. He dropped some decent gear upgrades, including another Leoric's crown. This time it had a nice amount of strength on it, so I happily put it on. Now if I only could find a nice gem to put in it. I found the fallen star that Cain was looking for. It turned out to be a man who I helped back to town. There was this merchant in town who was going to be an important part of my strategy for this challenge, because he sells rings and amulets, and this time he had an amulet with the stat I was looking for, +2 damage. It doesn't look like much, but for a character without a weapon, rings and amulets are as far as I know the only source of increasing your base damage. The 2 to 4 damage on this amulet more than doubled my damage output, from just under 6 to almost 13. And with the gold to spare, I also bought one from my Templar friend. I went back to this merchant every time I was in town to check for upgrades. Buying a couple of plus damage rings would be a huge upgrade, since I had 2 fingers as opposed to just 1 neck. The damage increase was very noticeable, and I continued my adventure with newfound power and confidence. At level 12, I learned Blessed Hammer, the fan-favorite paladin skill from Diablo 2. It didn't deal as much damage as Shield Bash, but it had a great AoE coverage for a low mana cost, so I decided to swap my secondary skill. Soon after, I encountered my first treasure goblin. As a fellow loot goblin, it felt kind of bad to hunt him down and take his loot, but I'm sure he would have done the same if given the chance. On the next level, I unlocked Steed Charge, which wasn't going to help with my damage, but it made running between quest points a little bit faster. I also unlocked a usable passive skill, which was nice. I retrieved a part of the fallen Starman's sword from a cave and encountered Magda, my least favorite character in the entire Diablo franchise. After retrieving the second part of the sword, I went back to town. Then there was a cutscene. Basically, Deckard Cain goes to live on a farm in the countryside where he's happy and lives forever. He was definitely not killed off by an annoying butterfly demon from Hell's Middle Management. Surely Blizzard wouldn't do that, not to the most iconic character of the entire franchise. Anyway, just like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, I needed to pass through a cave with a giant spider to continue my quest. The Spider Queen was just a bump in the road, but she did drop a nice rare amulet. While it didn't increase my damage any further, it came with some nice defensive bonuses on top of the damage. And immediately after that, I found a big upgrade from my merchant friend in town. A ring with 3 to 6 damage. Luckily he sells as many copies of an item as you want, so with the gold to spare I bought 4 of them. Equipping 2 of these rings took my damage from 20 to over 50, and my Templar's damage from 15 to 40. This was a big spike in my damage output, and for a while it almost felt like I was playing a normal character. In fact, I felt so powerful that I decided to increase the difficulty setting to hard. I could always lower it back down later, and I figured it would be nice with some bonus experience while I had the opportunity. Thanks to the damage upgrade and the AoE of the Blessed Hammer skill, I could handle large groups of enemies relatively easily, even on hard. But strong elite enemies started to become a real threat. I know I just increased the difficulty, but this elite was by far the most dangerous enemy that I had encountered so far. I made my way to a place called the Halls of Agony, which looked like hell itself. The area was mostly no problem, apart from some of the aforementioned elites. I shortly found myself at the first act boss. Let's take a quick look at what my character looked like before entering the fight. I was still using Punish since it was the best single target primary attack I had, with a rune which increased my attack speed when blocking. As a secondary attack I was using Blessed Hammer. Though this was mainly for dealing with big groups of enemies, I decided to keep it since I didn't feel like changing my build too much. I also thought it would be useful to have a range attack for the fight. I was using Steed Charge for mobility and Taunt as a way to regenerate my mana. For my final skill, I had been using Laws of Valor for the slight boost to my attack speed, but for the boss fight I temporarily swapped it out for Laws of Justice to boost my resistances. As for my passive skills, I stuck with Righteousness to boost my mana, and as I had just unlocked another passive skill slot, I took Fanaticism to help me attack faster with Punish. As for my gear, nothing too special was going on except a legendary helm and the very important damage jewelry. I did go to the blacksmith to craft some rare equipment to replace the few magic items I was still using. Mainly looking for as much plus to strength as possible, because as important as base damage was, getting strength on as many pieces of armor as I could was also a big part of my damage output. Overall, I was feeling pretty decent, but to humble my confidence a little, I equipped this random magical hammer from my inventory and immediately 5x'd my damage. That helped, and suddenly I felt like I had brought a toothpick to a sword fight. The first act boss is a staple character of the Diablo series, the Butcher. How boss fights work in Diablo 3 is that you're locked in the area with the boss, so you can't escape if you notice that things aren't working out. It is a fight to the death. The areas are also designed so that you can't really hide or seek shelter very easily, and in the case of the Butcher, the floor sets on fire every now and then. I had intended to lower the difficulty back to normal before the butcher fight, but I forgot. Though it turned out that I worried for nothing. Even when standing on the burning floor as he was attacking me, he could barely hurt me. Well, I could barely hurt him either, but his health wasn't regenerating. It took a few minutes, but the butcher was defeated on the first try, and it was a decisive victory. As a reward, the butcher dropped a legendary Crusader shield for me. I don't know the legendary items of this game that well at all, so identifying this was quite exciting. The shield was a nice upgrade in stats, and it also had a secondary stat to boost my Blessed Hammer skill. Needless to say, I was quite happy with this find. Starting Act 2, I went straight to the jewelry merchant to check out his goods. He did have a 3 to 6 damage amulet for sale, which was more than the one I was using. It would hurt to lose those defensive stats, but I really needed to grab all of the damage that I could. Just upgrading the 2 to 4 amulet to the 3 to 6 one increased my damage from 58 to 65. And right after leaving town, a random enemy dropped some legendary shoulder armor. The special ability doesn't seem all that useful to me, but they were still a decent upgrade in stats. What a great way to start the new act. The first part of Act 2 takes place in the desert, and it was pretty easy. My primary attack was starting to feel a bit weak, but thanks to my new legendary shield, Blessed Hammer let me keep up even on hard difficulty. I'm no expert on the finer details of the damage calculation in Diablo 3, but I knew this kind of legendary effect on gear was super powerful, since it multiplies my total damage output when using the skill. My adventures in the desert eventually led me to a boss fight, and I got the chance to take revenge on Magda. I then went into the sewers under the city to rescue the witch Adria. As I defeated the enemies guarding her, I unlocked 2 new skills which I will be using. Akarat's champion has a very long cooldown, but gives you a big boost in power on demand for a limited time. I also unlocked the indestructible passive, which acts almost like an extra life that triggers automatically if you would take fatal damage. Back in town, I found a ring with 4 to 8 damage at the merchant. I wasn't even aware that you could buy rings with this much damage on them at this point in the game, so I was pleasantly surprised. Upgrading my 2 rings took my damage from 72 all the way to 88. I then went into the Oasis, on a quest to revive a dead guy named Sultan Kul. I quite like Act 2 actually, and though there was a decent variety in enemies and areas, not much interesting was happening for a while. At level 27, I unlocked a new passive skill. I didn't like giving up the extra life, but I was not in a position to pass up on any extra damage, and righteousness was an important part of my hammer spamming strategy. The passive claimed to increase my damage by 10%, and it delivered on the promise. The additional healing was also appealing, but at the moment I was not dealing holy damage with any of my skills. After summoning the ghost of Sultan Kul, he didn't try to hide his villainous character.
You were treacherous before. How do I know you won't be an even greater threat once you've been fully revived?
You don't. So you must ask yourself, how much would you risk to save this wretched world?
But we needed his help, so I decided to trust him. Before I left town again, I went to salvage my loot for crafting materials when I noticed that I had found an amulet with more damage and strength. Thanks to this, as well as several other gear upgrades giving me a lot more strength, I had almost doubled my damage already since starting Act 2. That was way better than I had expected for this point in the game. Still not good by any normal measures, but good enough to make me increase the difficulty another step to expert. I was expecting to hit a wall sooner or later, and I thought why not maximize the experience gain while the game was still progressing at a decent pace. I was helping Sultan Kul find his body, all in a day's work, when I found more legendary loot. This time it was a pair of bracers, and it turned out to be another legendary piece of armor that boosted my Blessed Hammer skill. A great find, and quite lucky I have to say, considering 2 of the 5 legendaries I've found so far had special abilities tied to a skill that I was already using. I did not realize it yet, but this in combination with my shield would turn out to be extremely potent. After collecting bits and pieces of Sultan Kul, we were able to resurrect him, and to the surprise of no one, he tried to bribe me with power to join him and then betrayed me when I refused. Thanks to my new legendary, I could spam Blessed Hammers all fight long, and I defeated him without much trouble. I was honestly surprised with how good my damage was without a weapon. Anyway, with the Black Soulstone secured, it was time to hunt down the Primevals, starting with the boss of Act 2, Belial. Before going into the fight, I crafted some new gear to replace some of the armor pieces that had not been upgraded in a while. The blacksmith kept being an invaluable asset for this challenge. For skills, I was still using Punish as my primary skill, even though I was using it less and less thanks to the legendary bracers allowing me to spam Blessed Hammer a lot more frequently, and I just unlocked a new rune for the skill which increased both the damage and the range. It also turned the damage type into Holy, which synergized well with the Holy Cause passive. As for my other skills, I swapped in Consecration for some extra healing, and once again I swapped out Laws of Valor for Laws of Justice. It might be flashbacks from being completely stuck on Belial on the hardest difficulty of Diablo 3 when the game first was released, but I have always had big respect for the damage that he can dish out. Finally, I was using Steed Charge for mobility and Akarat's Champion for the damage buff. For my passive skills, I swapped out Righteousness for Vigilant since I didn't need the additional mana against a single boss thanks to the bracers, then Holy Cause for the damage and the healing from holy damage, and finally Indestructible for the extra life. The fight started off easy. First with just some of his henchmen and then his weak humanoid form. Once defeated, he turned into his true self. The camera zoomed out and the real battle began. There was just a small platform for me to stand on, and Belial has some hard to dodge attacks. But I might have overestimated Belial, or maybe I overprepared, because he didn't stand a chance. Well, he stood for quite a while actually thanks to my underwhelming damage, but it was not a close fight. Belial dropped another legendary Crusader shield for me. This was of course exciting, but I was also very reluctant to replace the legendary effect of my current one. The stats were very tempting, but I just couldn't give up the power boost of my current shield. Besides, I was never a big fan of the Blessed Shield skill. After that slightly disappointing boss fight, I once again increased the difficulty, now up to Master. I then traveled to the third act where I found myself going straight into battle. Bastion's keep was under siege and I helped the soldiers fight off the demon invaders and light their signal beacons. There were a lot of demons everywhere, and after lighting all of the signal beacons and helping the soldiers raise their catapults, I went to clear out the rest of the keep. Things were starting to get a lot more dangerous now, between enemies who exploded themselves to deal a big burst of damage and dangerous elite enemies. I triggered the extra life from my passive several times while clearing out the areas below the keep. For fun, I decided to craft the best one-handed weapon available at my current level to see where I was at. And wow. The gap between my damage and what it could have been had increased a lot since last time I checked, with my damage increasing roughly tenfold by equipping the weapon. Oh well. So before leaving the keep to go after the next of the primevals, I again did what I could to upgrade my gear. I had unlocked the ability to craft jewelry in town, but it required gems which I had very few of. I decided to give it a try anyway and got a pretty nice ring giving me a decent damage upgrade. I spent the last of my crafting gems trying for another ring, but that one ended up being terrible. I also crafted some more shoulder armor, hoping for a strength upgrade, but I was quite unlucky and didn't see a single strength roll in 4 crafts. I didn't want to use up all of my crafting materials, so I took the loss and moved on. With the keep secured, I was now moving out onto the open battlefield. The game must have felt bad for me after my failed crafting, because outside of the keep I found a nice upgrade to my shoulder armor, allowing me to break 300 damage for the first time. I was looking for Azmodan, the next primeval and the boss of Act 3. There were some obstacles on the way though, like this nasty elite boss pack that killed me while I was trying to destroy something for a quest. I was partially to blame for getting caught in the frozen explosion, but elite boss packs had the potential to be really dangerous. They spawned with 2 abilities for now, and when they got a combination of movement disruption and some kind of burst damage, they could take me down really quickly. I got my revenge and made my way to a demon gate to a place called the Edge of the Abyss. That sounded like a terrible place to be, but Tyrael insisted that we went in. A boss fight was waiting for us on the other side, against a big monster called Siegebreaker. I began by trying to punch him with a regular attack a few times. Blessed Hammer was better though, and by that I mean that I could at least see his health bar changing. My character was in a weird spot where everything took a long time to kill, but bosses were not dealing nearly enough damage to kill me. So boss fights were really more boring than anything else. Siegebreaker was defeated within a few minutes, and I began my journey down into the depths of the Ariat crater. While bosses couldn't outdamage my defenses, other enemies certainly could. I managed to keep myself alive, but honestly it was purely thanks to the extra life from my passive, which had started to trigger more and more often against elite enemies. Desperate for upgrades, I tried crafting another ring as I had found a few more gems. Well, I guess I was constantly desperate for upgrades during this challenge, but I got a nice ring anyway, especially compared to my worst one. I also checked in with the merchants, and one of them had an amulet with a lot of damage on it. It didn't have much else to offer, but it made my damage jump from 380 to 430. It was kind of funny. Every time I felt like I was falling too far behind and started consider lowering the difficulty back down, I usually found some decent upgrade shortly after to keep me going. I was starting to think that the game wanted me to suffer, but just enough so that I wouldn't back down and make things easier. I found a new legendary helm, the Broken Crown. It was a small upgrade in stats, but the legendary ability seemed really useful. I could really use some more gems, and rubies in particular. All gear can have plus to strength, but some items can have sockets too, and having several high level rubies in my gear could be a great way to increase my strength further. I wasn't explicitly going to hell, but I was traveling mostly downwards, there were eternally suffering creatures in the background and fire and demons everywhere, so one could speculate. A spider lady called Cydaea introduced herself.
I suppose I should introduce myself.
She was another henchwoman of the Primevals, and she seemed to be running this place, but she left again as quickly as she made her appearance. Another couple of areas deeper, she returned, but I summoned my hammers for a few minutes and the fight was over. Back in town, I checked my loot and found a belt. It had some really nice primary stats, but it also had the most thorns damage I had seen on a piece of armor so far. I meant to talk about thorns damage at some point during this challenge, so let's do that now. Thorns damage is dealt back to enemies when they hit you. When I initially planned this challenge, I was considering using it as a way to deal damage without a weapon. The issue I found was that thorns damage you can find on gear early on is so low, and it's also quite rare compared to stats. The most accessible form is from socketing a topaz gem in your weapon, but that obviously doesn't work for this challenge. However, if I was going to start seeing thorns damage over 100 as a secondary stat on armor, it was certainly more appealing. The Crusader even has a passive which boosts your thorns damage by 50%, as well as some other skill runes that used thorns damage. I wasn't sure how commonly I was going to be seeing it going forward, but as I was not too far off unlocking the passive I mentioned earlier, I was going to keep an extra eye out for it. Shortly after, I faced Azmodan. I have been complaining about boss's damage so far, but Azmodan did land some big hits on me with one of his spells. If he would have used that one more frequently, or if his other abilities weren't so bad, he might have been a problem. Now most of the battle was me running around trying to dodge his most dangerous spell, while casting hammers as often as I could. I did beat him on the first try, and while he was the toughest act boss so far, he was nothing compared to some of the random elite monsters that I fought on my way down here. He dropped a legendary Crusader shield. It was the same one that I already found that had a legendary ability that boosted Blessed Shield. Now the stat increase was starting to look a bit too good to pass up. I wasn't sure which setup to go with, so I did some testing and found them to be of similar power, with Blessed Shield maybe slightly stronger. It was also a new skill that I hadn't really used before in this challenge, so I decided to make the swap. With my new gear setup, I went to the heavens of Act 4 and immediately regretted my decision. Act 4 started with a boss fight against a demon, and when it was alone, Shield Throw did not feel at all as good as Blessed Hammer. It felt clunky, had mana problems, and there was a chance I could miss my target. Against small groups of 3 or so enemies, Blessed Shield was awesome, thanks to the Shattering rune which could bounce back and forth between them several times. But as great as Blessed Shield was in that particular situation, Blessed Hammer was much better against big hordes of enemies and against single targets. Luckily, I had kept my old shield in the stash, and I quickly swapped back to my Blessed Hammer setup. I was just about to fight another boss, and Blessed Hammer felt as good as ever. It was starting to look like we were going to stick together until the end, unless I found some really good legendaries. Act 4 isn't as long as the other acts, and I haven't played the campaign in a while. I remember this act as being fun and unique. Not many games have you go to heaven and help angels fight off invading demons. But when I played through it now, it felt kind of generic, and a lot of the act felt like filler between boss fights. This doesn't mean it was easy though. Elite monsters could now spawn with up to 3 abilities, and I ran into some really difficult ones. Like this one that I had to kite in circles for 3 minutes because I couldn't tank their damage for more than a couple of seconds, or these ones that covered the entire floor in poisonous goo and then cloned themselves to make the fight 20 against 1. This was another big advantage of Blessed Hammer, as I could focus my attention on dodging enemy attacks while throwing out hammers randomly and they would eventually hit something. Next I fought this demon making a reappearance from Diablo 2, the infamous Isuel. He was very tanky as expected, and he had an unavoidable freezing attack. He just lacked the damage to take advantage of his unfair crowd control. It did take me almost 5 minutes to kill him though. Since it took so long, and since I was approaching the end of the act, after the fight I equipped a pretty good looking weapon that he dropped. and it skyrocketed my damage from 500 to over 9000, and that was with an empty socket, and gems can really boost your damage when socketed into weapons. I really don't know why I kept doing that to myself. Shortly after, I stood before the final fight against Diablo himself. Boss fights have somehow felt relatively easy so far in this challenge, so I increased the difficulty one final time to Torment 1. The Torment difficulties are really meant for the endgame, so this was hopefully going to be a challenge fit for Diablo. I started the fight by trying to give him a normal punch with my shield for fun. Nothing seemed to happen. But then I cast my Blessed Hammer and still nothing seemed to happen. Despite my low damage, the fight started off being not too hard. His most dangerous attacks were his AoE fireball that burned the ground and when he grabbed me and shouted at me. Both could be avoided with good movement, so I got hit by them many times. But he was standing still a lot between his attacks for some reason, so I had plenty of time to recover between getting hit. After hammering down about a third of his health, phase 2 of the fight began. And this phase was a real struggle. Shadow Diablo is very similar to phase 1 Diablo, so he wasn't the issue. The issue was my Shadow clone. He is supposed to be a copy of my character, but that guy is clearly using a weapon, so I would like to file an official cheating complaint against Diablo. The added damage from the clone is one thing, but what nearly killed me several times was when he cast Shield Glare to blind me. While I was blinded, I could not attack or move, so the two shadows could create a devastating combo together where the clone would blind me just as Diablo used his fireball attack, so I couldn't move away from the fire. This triggered my indestructible passive multiple times, and every time it did I tried to keep out of danger while the passive was on cooldown. Diablo could teleport and the clone could charge me with his shield, so I could not completely avoid combat, and I got really close to dying a few times while my passive was on cooldown. This fight was super intense, which was just what I wanted from Diablo. I eventually managed to beat the second phase after taking down a total of 3 shadow clones and finally Shadow Diablo. I was released from the Shadow Realm and the fight entered the third phase. At this point I had been fighting Diablo for over 15 minutes, so the stakes were high because if I died now I would have to start the entire fight over. There were no more Crusader clones to mess with the control of my character, but Diablo himself had become much more dangerous. He used his fireball attack much more often and he could now use his iconic lightning hose attack, and that one really hurt if I got caught in it. It did get easier to dodge once I've seen the attack a few times, but when I did get caught in the attack it was difficult to outrun because of my low movement speed. The healing from Consecration, the added resist from Laws of Justice and the panic escape button of Steed Charge all came to prove extremely useful in this fight. And of course the indestructible passive, which saved me a couple of times in the third phase as well. While the last phase started off really chaotic and with some close calls, once I got familiar with his attack patterns my confidence grew stronger and eventually it was just a matter of time and not messing up. The end of the fight was not as intense as phase 2, but it was a real grind. After a total of almost half an hour, I finally defeated Diablo. This was a real challenge with several close calls. He did drop a legendary for me. Unfortunately it was a weapon, but I didn't care as much about the loot as the game was over. Oh, right, Act 5. I'm kidding of course, I hadn't forgotten about the expansion act. I have only played through it once or twice though, so I was not very familiar with it. I do remember it being much longer and harder than the other acts though, which makes sense since it's basically a whole expansion crammed into a single act. As much fun as I was having with this challenge, it had gone on for quite some time already, so for the last act I lowered the difficulty all the way back down to normal. My intention from the start was to do the whole playthrough on normal. I honestly never expected to be able to do so well on the higher difficulties. Act 5 has a lot of content. The gist of the story is that there's a new bad guy in town, the corrupted angel Malthael, who stole the Black Soulstone in which we trapped all of the primevals that we defeated in the base game, so now we have to hunt him down and take back the Soulstone. Since finding the broken crown, I had now acquired a decent pile of rubies. In fact, I now had enough to fill 5 sockets in my body armor and pants with the highest rubies I could make. In order to make even higher gems, I would need to upgrade the jeweler, and that requires an item called Death's Breath, and as far as I know that is only available in the endgame after completing the campaign. Still, 58 strength per gem was nothing to sneeze at. The act began with a quest to save the town of Westmarch, which was being corrupted by Malthael and his angels, turning the townsfolk into monsters. I encountered the first mini-boss of the act, who was quite easy, or well, the game felt like it was easy considering I didn't have a weapon, but it was still my legendary shield carrying me. I did a quick comparison against some zombies and my Blessed Hammer dealt a lot of damage for just 10 mana. These were just trash mobs, but 2 to 3 hits wasn't awful. Then I swapped skill to Shield Bash with a rune that gives it a huge damage multiplier, much bigger than my Blessed Hammer. And this is what fighting trash mobs might have looked like if I hadn't found that shield. It would have driven me insane. And then I was faced with a proper boss fight. The demon Yusrael, who was the last order of business to save the town for now. I really liked this boss fight. A demon shooting you with a hand cannon felt a bit out of place in the Diablo universe, but I liked it. It's a unique and fun fight. After I defeated the gun demon, I went into a swamp to look for some quest items. I honestly wasn't paying much attention to the story. I did however pay attention to all the loot I could get my hands on, like this legendary belt drop. The legendary ability didn't seem that useful for this character, but a legendary is always nice. I then found a really nice amulet. It had more damage and some other damage boosting stats too. Equipping it increased my damage by over 100. Then I had to restart my game, because somehow a notification that I destroyed some clay pots got stuck on my interface. Then it was time to fight Adria, who had turned into a demon. If you haven't played this game, you might be confused as I haven't really explained the story very well. Adria was working for Diablo the entire time, and she betrayed us between Act 3 and 4 when she helped set Diablo free. For a moment I almost forgot that I had set the difficulty back to normal, because she was soaking up a lot of my damage. I defeated her after a few minutes of hammer spam, got no good drops, and went back to town. My quest then took me back to heaven, where angels were fighting demons once again. I met up with the angel Inarius, who proved to be absolutely overpowered, but he only helped out when he felt like it. While helping the angel fight off some demons, I found a legendary crusader shield. The legendary skill didn't seem too useful to me, but the stats were mouth-watering. However, I was not giving up my current shield for almost anything at this point. I fought a bunch of demons on top of a battering ram while it was breaching a gate. I didn't remember this part of the game at all, but it was a cool little sequence. The ram eventually breached the gate and I entered the Pandemonium Fortress. I have been skipping ahead a fair bit in Act 5 and I'm doing it again, since the Pandemonium Fortress was just a bunch of enemies in a maze with a tedious amount of backtracking on narrow platforms. A few levels down into the fortress, it was time to face the final boss of the expansion. I did the fight on normal difficulty, but even then it was a challenge. He could tank my attacks really well and deal a lot of damage back to me in bursts if I wasn't careful. The first phase didn't require too much thinking on my part, except dodging his orbiting skull attacks. Those hurt a lot. In phase 2 he has some more dangerous attacks, but I managed to keep out of harm's way for the most part. The reason I didn't increase the difficulty like I did with Diablo is because I think the Malthael fight is bullshit. Maybe I'm just getting old and slow, but he doesn't telegraph most of his attacks far enough in advance. He dashes across the battlefield in an instant and the fighting area is too small. But I eventually conquered phase 2 as well and defeated the final boss of Diablo 3. He dropped a legendary mace, which looked really strong compared to what else I had found recently, so one last time I decided to see how far behind my damage actually was. And equipping this increased my damage almost 30 times. Once victory was assured, Tyrael finally sent me back to the main menu. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, here's another one where I try to beat Diablo 2 with only poison damage. And I mean only poison damage, so getting anything done at level 1 was a challenge. But I found a clever solution.